heroes. Sometimes we think of heroes and we think of heroes who do extraordinary things because they were born to it. You know, we have somewhat glorified heroes in today's culture. If you think about the word hero, immediately what comes to mind is the Marvel. You think of Spider-Man, you think of Iron Man, maybe you might think Superman. You may think of these people who stand larger than life. People who have these superhuman powers. And the reality is that as heroes, most of the heroes that have come through our society, through history, have actually been just normal people heeding the call of God in their lives. Just people who have just stepped up when times have called for it. And that's what I want to challenge you today, in understanding and perceiving this idea that God has called every one of us to step up to a potential in our lives that is beyond ourselves, and it calls upon God's wisdom, His discernment, and His power to enable us to do what we can't do on our own. But all that we've been called to do is be obedient. In Exodus chapter 2, it starts like this. Read along with me. Now a man from the house of Levi went, and he took as a wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived, and she bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took him a basket made of bulrushes, and she daubed with it bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Sometimes we have this glorified mentality. Really, what we call it is the Sunday school version of Scripture, where we make it into a fun experience when we realize that there were some real things that were happening here. Real people died in a real river by real evil intentions in an evil nation. So she put the child in it. She placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And the sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her young women walked beside the water, she saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from among the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went, and she called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you wages." So the woman took the child, and she nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down that Egyptian, and he hid him in the sand. And when he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" And he answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid, and he thought, "Surely the thing is known." And when Pharaoh heard it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh, and he stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priests of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and saved them, and he watered their flock. And when they came home to their father Reuel, he said, how is it that you have come home so soon today? They said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock. And he said to his daughters, then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. And she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom. And he said, I have been a sojourner in a land. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cries for the rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Modern day heroes. I think of some of the heroes in my life, and none of them wear spandex. Praise God. But there are people who have spoken words of affirmation, words of life into my life, into my ministry, into my family. People that you probably will never meet, whose name you'll probably never know. People who have had an influence, but their influence has been limited to the people in their spheres of influence. And I think of some of these modern day heroes for me. And I think about how they gave. Many of them gave without knowing what they were giving towards. Not knowing where they were going to lay their treasure. I remember one general council with the Assemblies of God. It was here in Orlando, and I had taken Jasenia with me. And it was Jasenia's first general council. We were just kind of hanging out. We were going different places, and it was in Orlando. Have you ever been to the big convention center in Orlando? We had to walk. What was it? It felt like miles, right, Jasenia? It was like a mile and a half or something like that from the convention, from our hotel to the convention center, which was attached to the convention center. And it was a lot. And every day there was something going on. And there was a pastor of a fairly large church in Arkansas. And as we're walking through the convention center, he stops me and he's like, hey, just striking up a conversation. He looked at Jasenia and he said, hey, are you his daughter? And Jasenia said, yeah. And she was ready to move on. She wanted to get some food. We wanted to go to the food court. Well, he looks at her and he says, you stick in there. He reaches into his pocket. You remember this, Jasenia? You remember this when the guy pulled out and gave you a $100 bill, your first $100 bill? Yeah, you don't remember that? How could you not remember that? Unfortunately, she's got several $100s after that, so she just thinks everybody just hands out $100 bills. But I just think about that interaction, and recently I had a conversation with him again, and I shared that with him, and he said, I don't remember that, but thank you. He says, I just do as God leads me. And I said, well, that was one of the most tumultuous years of our ministry. It was when we first took over this church, as we were trying to figure out, God, what is it that do you want us to stay here? How do you want us to progress with this? And it was just one of those words that were spoken in season. It was one of those things, just those kind acts that say, hey, you know what? There are people behind you. You stand on the shoulders of other people who are continuing to pursue the voice of God, continuing to listen to the voice of God. And they're imperfect people. Many of them are imperfect. They're imperfect like I'm imperfect, but they're seeking the will of God in their life. And when I think about that, I think about Moses. I think about the slavery that he's experiencing through the eyes of someone who's standing 100 feet away from it. But he can relate to what's going on with his people. Just recently I was at the Lincolnville Museum right here in downtown. And one of the exhibits that we were walking around, we had a personal tour that they were doing with a group of local leaders, and the curator hands me these shackles. And they're old shackles. They're shackles actually from an old slave ship in the late 1700s. And he hands me these shackles. He says, my ancestors used to have these placed on their ankles. And as I'm looking at these shackles, I'm realizing these things are heavy, first of all. And when they're formed, there's all jagged edges on them. They weren't handcuffs like we know them today. They weren't comfortable. They were heavy. They were roughly hewn. They were roughly made. They were jagged on the inside. And I'm thinking, and I asked him, I said, when they put these on, wouldn't this do damage to the person's limbs? And he said, most of the times they did. That's why most of the slaves would just sit while they were being transported, while they were in shackles, because it could actually fracture their femur bone. And a lot of the injuries that happened because of the shackles that were put on them. And it takes you to a time to understand that real people suffered really in a real way, in a real and tangible way. And sometimes we minimize that because we live in a culture where everything becomes so easy. And we don't understand the pains and the hurts that have brought people to this place. But there has always been those who have heeded the voice of God, have said, you know what? Evil is evil and good is good. God is faithful in the midst of all of the torture, all of the hurt, all of the pain, even in death. God is faithful. We serve a God who does not change, even though the hearts of men are evil and wicked. God does not change. So when I look at this story and I realize from that perspective that there is evil, there is real wickedness in this world, we can also rest on this one assurance that we can be blessed even in the midst of great pain. You and I can be blessed in the midst, even as we're experiencing pain in this life, we can see and feel the blessing of God. We can experience what it truly means to live above our circumstances. God has called us to live above our circumstances. When I look at this, I think about this, how God orchestrated even in the midst of what was happening here. Do you understand what was truly happening here? There was a Holocaust that was happening here. There were people who were suffering. As a matter of fact, that same Nile River that would become the place where God would use to bring liberation to His people as a young babe was put into a wicker basket and set on that water, amongst the reeds, was the same river that just the chapter before, as we closed last week, we saw that the Egyptians were told to throw all of the Israelite boys into that river and kill them and drown them. The same river that brought destruction would also bring healing. See, God has a plan and God has a purpose and God has a destiny for us, but it doesn't mean that it's going to happen without pain. Listen, the reality is that we live in a fallen world where pain is real, where hurt is real, where what we're going cannot be minimized, where the circumstances of the past cannot be put over. We can't put rose-colored glasses over it. We've got to accept and embrace the pain that has happened in the past and say, hey, we're willing to move beyond this. That today is a fresh start. That this is the moment that God has called us to. This is the opportunity that God has given to us. I find it interesting. The same word that's used there for basket, when baby Moses was put in a basket, in the Hebrew, the same word that's used there is actually the same word that is used in Genesis when it talks about Noah hewed for himself an ark. It is the same word in the Hebrew. The ark that would bring Noah and his children through the flood, that same word, that same description was used when God said that he would bring the deliverer of his people out. And he said it as an ark. She placed the baby in there, and the mother walks away. Mom had accepted what was about to happen, but she accepted it with hope and with assurance that God would do what God would do. And she would do what she could possibly do. So she takes that wicker basket, she fills it with pitch, she surrounds it with pitch so that it becomes somewhat waterproof, so that the baby doesn't drown as he's laid in the reeds among there. And she says, God, your will be done. God, your will be done. And she walks away. The Bible says that the sister stood around waiting to see what would happen. Mom had left. Do you understand? Mom had left. Mom said, it is all in God's hands now. But sister sticks around. And she waits. And she anticipates. And she waits to see what God will do. I pray that some of us, when we're ready to say, hey, I don't have any more control over this circumstance. I can't do anything else about it. I'm going to step back and I'm going to watch. I'm going to let God do what God's going to do. I'm going to watch from afar. And then when it's ready, when I'm ready, when God has that time appointed for me to step in, I will step in. But I'm going to stop trying to do it my way. I'm going to stop trying to be the deliverer for my people. I'm going to stop trying to be the savior for my family. I'm going to stop trying to be the person that is constantly nagging my spouse to come to church. I'm going to be the person that stops nagging my children, saying, you're not doing it the way it's supposed to be done. I'm going to step back and I'm going to say, God, I've done what I can do. You take control. You take the reins. Because I can't do it anymore. Listen, that doesn't mean that we're not purposeful. It doesn't mean that we don't do our part, because the mother did her part. And the daughter stepped back and she waited to see, because she knew mom had done her part. And so when we do our part, we've got to let go and let God. Once we've stepped into that experience, we've got to be able to know that God has his hand in what he will do. God will do what he will do. He's got his hands already in that situation. He's got his hands already in that circumstance, and his will be done. Amen? Amen. So Pharaoh's daughter comes. She's surrounded by a bunch of her maidens. She's walking down the riverside, about to go take a nice little plunge into the water, and she hears a baby crying. She sees this basket, and she goes over to where it's at, and she picks it up, and she takes it in. And the sister comes and she says, hey, do you need a wet nurse? I know a wet nurse. I know somebody who can provide this child the nourishment that they need. And Pharaoh's daughter says, absolutely. And she runs back to mama. And God did what God would do. And God brought deliverance. Listen, but does that happen every time? No. I'll be honest, it doesn't happen every time. But one thing that we are assured of, that God's plan will come to pass as God had already predestined it to come to pass. But we have got to be decisive in our decisions. That's my second point. Be decisive. Who do you stand with? And who do you stand for? Where are you willing to draw the lines in your life? What are you willing to say, this is right and this is wrong? Because the story progresses from that point. I mean, it goes immediately from his birth to this, verse 11. Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out to his brethren to look at their burdens. He went to look at what they were going through. He was compelled within his heart to see the suffering of his own people. There was something that was stirring inside of him that said, hey, something's not right in Egypt today. And something's not right amongst my brothers, and I've got to see this for myself. And when he saw the Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren, he looked this way and he looked that way. And when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. He made a decision to stand with his people. You say, Pastor, this is murder. Is it murder? Moses was actually a prince of Egypt. And as such, he had the power to take anybody's life without any question. And there was no question about his authority to do that. Here's where the problem lies. Here's where we get stuck sometimes. It's that gray area, right? It's that area where we wonder, is this really God? Is this really the tactic that I need to take in order to do the right thing? And then if I'm decisive in doing what I'm doing, how will it affect other people? Because the reality is that every decision that you and I make has an equal and opposite effect on other people that are all around you. Every decision that you make in this life not just affects you. Here's the rub, my friend. That your decision, many of us, we get so caught up with this. We think, well, this is my life. It's one life. It's my life. I'm going to live it how I'm going to live it. Everybody else will just deal with my decision. Here's the problem, is that everybody is dealing with your decision. So as he took a decisive measure, he knew in his heart this was what he needed to do. But was he really listening to God? He knew in his heart that he had to stand for his people. Good intentions, bad outcome. Good intentions, bad outcome. So how do I not compromise? How do I move and be decisive in what God has called me to do? This is the difference. Look at what it says. Before he kills him, what does it say he did? I look this way and I look that way. If I'm having to look around to see if anybody's looking at what I'm doing, bad. I'm bad. Put that in the column that says, hey, this is not the right thing to do. If I'm having to make sure that nobody is looking at what I'm doing, listen, that's when you start having skeletons in your closet or Egyptians in the sand. We may have to change that term. I'm just going to start calling it Egyptians in the sand for you. At least we'll understand that in the church and nobody else will think about skeletons in your closet. How many Egyptians do you have in the sand? How many things have you covered up? And as you're challenged with this, listen, his intentions were right. And listen, and that's the thing, is that for many of us, our intentions are right, but we went around the wrong way doing it. And we compromised on what was right. So then, how do you recover from that? Keep looking. He says this. Look, he says, so he looked this way and that way. Verse 13. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting. And he said to the one who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? And he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. He feared the repercussions. There were things that were going on in his heart. He was already still contemplating what he did. Listen, this is called conviction. So he gets up. Of course, it doesn't help that Pharaoh hears about what he did and realizes that Moses' intentions were not for him to exercise power. Because it could have been easy for him to just stay there and say, hey, you know what? I did this because I am the prince of Egypt. I can kill. That person was not doing what he should have been doing. And he could have easily stood on his merits as the prince of Egypt. Easily. Very easily. He could have justified what he did. But he didn't. Why? Because he would not compromise. It could have been easy for him to say, hey, you know what? I can bring deliverance for the people of Israel out of this bondage as the prince of Egypt. When I finally become the next Pharaoh, hey, let my people go. Yes, I will let my own people go. It could have been his decision at that point to say, hey, I will let my people go. He could have taken the easy route, but he realized this. He realized this, that even though he had the opportunity to bring liberation to his people by using the platform where he was at, the platform was not the platform that God intended for him. It was not what God intended for him. God had called him, and God would speak to him, and God would direct him. And in his heart, he felt the conviction that was there, and he ran. And Pharaoh goes after him, but then he can't find him. Why? Because he fled. And he goes to the land of Midian. Verse 16. Now the priest of Midian has 7 daughters. And they came and they were drawing water, and they filled the troughs with the water from their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away. What shepherds? The other shepherds that were there competing with them land. And they were trying to steal their flock. Now Moses steps in here. This is murderer Moses. At this point, he could have taken care of this problem very easily. He was a trained warrior. But look at what the Bible says. Verse 17. But Moses stood up and he helped them. Moses stood up and he helped them. I want to challenge you today to be persistent. Do not let your failures define you. Instead, learn from them. Do not let your failures put a label on you in your life. Instead, learn from your failures and seek the help that you need, or even just get away so that you can start fresh and anew. It was by faith. Listen to this. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23 through 27. It was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God, listen, that God had given them an unusual child. And they were not afraid to disobey the king's commands to save their son. So it was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He what? He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And he did what? Chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought that it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt. For he was looking ahead to his great reward. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. It wasn't the fear of the king's anger. It was by his faith that he left the reward that was there for him to seek a greater reward. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who was invisible. He knew God was speaking to him. Conviction was in his heart. He was moving in the direction that God had for him. He would not allow the circumstances to define him. He allowed God's identity to define who he was. God had an identity for him. God had called him, and he had delivered him. He saw God. I find it interesting, all throughout this chapter, we see that word saw a lot. We see it a lot. As a matter of fact, it says the daughter of Pharaoh came down to the river and she saw the ark. It said that his sister saw Pharaoh's daughter and she went to him. It says that he looked this way, he looked this way and that, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian. The word saw is used quite a bit there. It's a unique word in this particular passage. It means this. It means to see. It's the word yara. It means to see and to be moved. It means to see, not just to see with your eyes, but to see with your heart and with your intention, and then be moved by it. And when he saw, there was something that stirred in his heart to hear God's voice, to listen to what God was saying, and to be moved in the direction that God had for him. If we allow our failures to dictate our identity, we will become blind to what God is trying to do in our lives. You have got to allow God to move in your heart. You've got to allow God to speak into your circumstance and into your situation, and not allow the circumstance to blind you to God's call and purposes. If you will just see, you will be moved. If you will just see with the eyes that God has for you, you will be moved. Fifth thing I want us to talk about here. Look at this. Verse 21, Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah, his daughter, to Moses, and she bore him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in this foreign land. Now it happened in the process of that time that the king of Egypt died. And the children of Israel groaned because of their bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of their bondage. Here Moses is standing in the land of plenty, if you will. 7 daughters, one to whom he would eventually marry. Flocks, unlike anything he's seen at that point, because he didn't have to deal with any of that. He just took a tax from that before that point. And he's realizing the reality of his circumstance while his people are oppressed. I want to challenge you in this thought. I want you to be realistic in what you can possibly do. And I want you to deal with, I'm going to make the statement, and I hope you understand it. I want you to deal with the disillusionment that you have in the body of Christ, with the body of Christ. See, so many of us were disillusioned by what the body of Christ does not do. We say, well, I can't believe that. That church is, man, they're as big as they are, they should be doing more. We think, oh, as talented as that person is, why aren't they doing more? I don't understand why this person, when I call them, they don't call me right back, and they don't answer, they don't do what I need them to do. And I want you to deal with the disillusionment in your own mind that people ought to operate the way that you expect them to. I've dealt with it. I've already settled that in my heart. I want to tell you, I don't push you more than what you can. I know that there's a lot of teaching out there, pastoral teaching out there that says, have an expectation beyond what your people have so that you can push them beyond what they can possibly do. I want to tell you this. I know that you're real, that you hurt, that your hurts are real, that you have life that you're dealing with. I'm not going to push you beyond that. I'm going to challenge you to step up to the calling that God has for you. But if you're not willing to step up, I'm not going to chase after you, because the reality is that I've already dealt with the disillusionment that people are imperfect. We think people should be perfect. Reality is that we aren't. None of us are. I hope that doesn't crush your vision of me. The reality is that I'm not perfect. Amen. I got more amen. Wait a minute. I shouldn't acknowledge that. I got too many amens on that one. Here's the reality. We're all flesh. We're all imperfect. And God has a call on us. He has a call on you. He has gifted you with something. You're not in charge of babysitting so-and-so. You're in charge of doing what God has called you to do. At that moment, Moses was called to be with his now new wife, father-in-law. I don't know if there was a mother-in-law in the mix. That might be why he left eventually. I don't know. No, I'm just kidding, Mom. I might have stuck myself in that one. But the reality is this, that the people were going through real pain, and they were expecting Moses to step up at that point. But it wasn't God's time. It wasn't God's time. And for many of us to deal with that disillusionment, with that reality, hey, but you know what? I want to tell you this. The people of God are standing up. We may think that they're not. But when you look at what's happening around our world, when you look at Convoy of Hope has already stationed multiple thousands of tons of food in Virginia to meet the need in North Carolina, even before we even had a thought about it. The body of Christ is on the move. We are doing. It may not happen in our timing, and it may not happen the way that we want it to. It may not happen in the way that we expect it to. But God's people are standing up, and they're doing good, positive, wonderful, spirit-filled things to impact our community. And if all we ever dwell is, well, this person didn't do this the way that I wanted them to do it, then we will miss out on the things that God is doing. And celebrating the victories. I want to tell you this. Can I share this great victory with you? We had a goal to raise $2,500 to buy a piece of property in Indonesia for a church. We have, as of last Sunday, we have raised $1,500. On top of everything else that we're doing. Listen, I want to tell you this. We can celebrate in the fact that God is doing what God will do. He will move upon His people, and in His perfect timing, we will see the reality of what He has intended. Last point, and I'm going to make this very brief. The last thing He says, God knew. These words, God knew, are pregnant with hope. God knew. God was aware of each person's suffering. He understood what was happening to them and how it was affecting them. God knew the dehumanizing degradation and the pain that they were really feeling on that day in that slavery experience. He knew the premature breakdown of bodies that were ruthlessly, exhaustively used in manual labor. As we saw in the previous chapter, He saw that they were weary. He knew that they were tired. He saw the bitter erosion of hope that was taking place in that community. He knew. He knows what you're going through. He knows the horror of the pain that you've gone through. He knows the horror of the abuses that you've been subjected to. He knows the pain of that divorce that you went through. He knows the pain of the issues that you dealt with as people called you names and said, you're just too dumb. You're just not getting it. You're an idiot. You're dumb. You're stupid. Whatever it is that has been called, those labels that have been placed on you. He knows the pain. God knows. He knows the bitterness of that relationship that didn't go the way that you thought it was going to go. And now there's friction where there once was love. But not only did God know, God foreknew. The Bible is very clear. Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 through 14, He already knew that they were going to be enslaved. It says, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. He understood the implications of that. But God had a plan. God knew what He was doing. Because 2 verses later in Genesis 15, God tells Abram, and your descendants shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquities of the Amorites is not yet complete. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. But this is what He's saying. He's reminding them that they will suffer, but He will bring them through. And He will be exalted above the circumstance. He will be exalted above the circumstance. God knows what you're going through. He knows your pain. He knows your disillusionment. But He also knows His plan will unfold in your life. And if it doesn't happen at this moment, right here, right now, He gives us this promise. That one day, as we're going through this, as we're walking this faith walk in the midst of craziness, in the midst of real life, that we have an inheritance waiting for us, in which there will be no more pain, no more suffering, no more hurt. It is the promise of eternal life in His glorious presence because of the price that Jesus paid for you. With every eye closed and every head bowed, I want to ask you this question this morning. Have you surrendered your life to God's perfect plan? Have you asked Him to be Lord of your life, even in the midst of the craziness? And that just doesn't, sometimes it just doesn't sound right. You're saying, Pastor, you're speaking two things. You're saying that God's going to be there for me. God's going to be there and help me through this hurt. But you're also telling me that hurt's going to happen. Listen, I want to tell you, the reality is that life happens, but God is there and God is faithful. And you can have joy even in the midst of pain. It's a conundrum for us to understand that. But the reality is that God is faithful despite our circumstances. As I looked at those shackles at the Lincolnville Museum, you continue to go through. And as you're walking down some of the exhibits, you realize the importance of faith among that community. As they would sing hymns, they would talk about God's deliverance. That those whom Christ has set free are free indeed. And talk about how even in the midst of hurt, in the midst of pain, God is faithful. The reality is this, that irregardless of the circumstance that we're going through, God loves you. And even while you were still yet a sinner, He sent His Son to die for you. You didn't deserve it. You didn't merit it. but He freely gave it. And Jesus died on a cross willingly so that you might have life, and life in abundance.